Hi, this is 14 Cases of Act Right. The Edgar haircut can be described as a round, banged, short but long hairstyle. It's one that frames the face, focusing from the forehead and making sure that the fade is apparent and clean. Now, this haircut has been primarily worn by Mexican boys or boys of color starting in the year of 2020. The Edgar haircut became common in areas like New Mexico, LA, Texas, the border states. Now, constantly do we see jokes being placed on how this type of person is from America. Now, you look at these young men, we also have to understand this. Their culture is a mixture of what happens to indigenous culture and indigenous people through time and space, especially in Latin America. Now, memes around their haircuts associate the people who wear it with a lower class or having a sheltered Mexican experience, with a lack of respect to the modern Mexican American culture and cholo culture, as the connotation of it is kind of considered flashy or trashy. And I like to think about it as the Guido of American hairstyle, as far as just putting context to the feeling. Noted that the Edgar haircut is primarily worn by Gen Z and later millennial brown men. When we get down to the racial implication of Mexican Americans, we can see that it is highly coded in a mixed racial history of the country, and oftentimes, a certain set of features categorize you. These categorizations work as the integral structure of who gets a better quality of life, aka racism and all its glorious ways. The idea that we are more separated from one kind of ethnicity because of the designations of state and government is how we heavily identified and kind of take pride in as Mexican Americans, which isn't always so obvious, and I think obvious is my polite way of saying it isn't always acknowledged. Now, the racial structure of Mexico is always overlooked due to who gets to play at which axes: media, politics, and ownership. I can pull at least 3 articles or pieces of evidence saying that indigenous people have been disregarded and silenced within Mexico's politics, but almost in such a microaggression way. I think it can kind of help us explain how the Mexican American culture treats indigenous and different ethnicity traditions and just overall the respect towards the indigenous history within your Mexican American identity. Regarding the different ethnic backgrounds in Mexico, the region that was sanctioned below, whereas modern day California, Texas, New Mexico, we've been over this. It is a product of history like the whole world, and I say this to say that there's different people that immigrated there. There are different indigenous people that have always been there, and there have been just a melting pot of community and ethnicity, racial background that add to the person that makes the Mexican identity. Now, there has become this sense of pride and again, hinting on why I think nationalistic behavior is encouraged within our Mexican identity towards, we've had a sense of ownership towards this land, and the whole background is the reality of our even blood being what we are is not something that was naturally given. The point is, I think the Western agenda, the colonization agenda, is to think that the assimilation towards Western identity and moving yourself further from an indigenous identity is what is going to make you a more powerful person or make you a abiding citizen, whatever that means. So it's just hilarious. Why the hell are we thinking that we have a right to any type of land when literally our identity is forced upon us based off of like genocide and colonialism and just the history that is at play here? That like quiet tension is, you know, in our jokes. And like what I love about humor is what I believe is a lot or a little bit can be true. So when we see these memes displaying like blatant prejudice towards certain ethnicities, it does come from a place of like wanting to assimilate to colonialism and colonization. And I'm sorry that is, well, again, my bias. I'm sorry that that's kind of like what this video is boiling down to, but it's just the fact that indigenous opinions, indigenous voices, indigenous people on a global aspect have been disregarded completely, and just in a completely unhumane expectation for them to try to thrive and live with, you know, within any type of town and country and border. Like we see that on the forefront. So that's what we're kind of discussing today, is like the lack of identity and recognition within your indigenous history inside, in the assimilation to nationalism is kind of what dilutes your culture in general. But I think it's an unknowingly but knowingly agenda for modern Mexican identity. And it's hard because, you know, I feel like there's tension amongst indigenous community, modern Gen Z. I don't know why I said modern, but Gen Z trying to, you know, have a sense of identity and with their indigenous side, depending on what that means and what access into that culture that they've had.
I think a lot of us have become more critical of this proximity to whiteness and what that does to how much solidarity you can actually have with that person, not just based off of the different experiences you might have, but also maybe the privileges or things they're willing to put up with versus what you are or are not because you can't afford to. Hopefully that made sense. I don't know how else to say it. But I'm going to be vulnerable and speak to any sort of negative ill will or weird feelings I might have had towards biracial and mixed race people when they are mixed with Black and other things. Mainly being that their race is mutable. Depending on how mixed your background is, people don't always know how to classify you. And that's something to me that I will admit I'm envious of, because it's like, oh, you're able to not have the stereotypes and perceptions associated with X identity placed on you because people don't know what you're all mixed with.
Like, is kind of like not spoken about and overlooked. So when reading an article that was actually posted in 1995 by the University of California, we can see that indigenismo was always a construction of the dominant culture, particularly that the elite of intellectual mestizos who used indigenous issues to advance their own political agendas. Lesfield has noted that although indigenismo has categorized anti-hegemonic intellectual, political, and economical elites to appropriate indigenous culture for nation-building ideologies that end up maintaining the subaltered state of indigenous people. Often this ideology was set in the context of allegedly conservative rural campesino indigenous population looking to urban intellectual elites to awaken a dormant revolutionary indigenous spirit. Nevertheless, these developments elevated indigenous causes and made them a significant factor for political parties and labor unions. In this way, indigenismo became part of campesino, workers, and student movements for national and social change. Particularly with the institutionalization of indigenismo into official government policies, it became a tool of dominant culture to incorporate indigenous people into their concept of unified nation state. Marie Chantal Barry argues that indigenismo Indigenismo requires that ethnic groups participate in the development of policies which affect them. Unfortunately, in all of the countries which have had indigenous policies, exactly the opposite has happened. Furthermore, she has noted distinction between classical indigenismo from the 1930s, which, while being a paternalistic impulse from the dominant culture, at least, sought to address questions of oppression and exploitation with later indigenistas policies of various Latin American governments which did not face or seek to change the structural oppression which indigenous feelings that I get towards indigenous recognition within the Mexican American identity is so deeply in our, makeup because of the type of nationalist ideology that our culture kind of wants us to be involved with, that I think is just not put on the front page. Like, literally, politically, this is a motivation to westernize a area and to disregard a population of, people, specifically indigenous people. Now,
a lot of Mexicans are racist and colorist. Let's take for example Yaritza y su esencia. Some Mexicans are referring to them as Cheño, bro looks like he just got out of the Guatemalan jungle. Por lo menos hubieran esperado que pasara la polémica con los cara de artesanía oaxaqueña. La carita de azteca que tiene, porque le hacen por la tizoc si yo soy igual de mexichango y soy igual que él. Prietos los tipos y delicados. They are also being compared to characters like those from Apocalipto and captioning it La India Yaritza y los tacuaches de la sierra, or this post where they're comparing them to these little kids from the movie Apocalipto. Cuando Yaritza apareció en la película Apocalipto, comparing her to La India María, this indigenous woman that has nothing to do with Yaritza, and calling her La India Yaritza. This is a clear example of how colorist Mexicans are and how common it is to dehumanize indigenous people back in Mexico. As someone who grew up in the motherland, I do not support their take on Mexico, but the racism and colorism is not okay.